I saw a girl who looked exactly like my twin daughters. And that was only the beginning. I was pumping gas when I saw her. She looked just like Taylor and Delia, only older. Maybe 6 instead of 4. I almost called out to her before I caught myself because my girls were at preschool. Just a funny coincidence, I thought. But then another little girl came out of the store and my hand froze on the gas pump. The second girl was identical to the first one. They were twins. Twin girls who looked exactly like my twin girls, just 2 years older. Their mom was loading them into a silver minivan, and I found myself walking over before I could think about what I was doing. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice shaking. The woman turned around and smiled politely, but her expression changed when she saw my face. "Oh God, you have them too," she whispered. "How old are yours?" I couldn't speak for a moment because her question made no sense but also made perfect sense. 4, I managed to say. "Twin girls. They're at preschool." She nodded slowly and looked around the parking lot like someone might be watching us. "Mine are 6 and there's another set in my neighborhood that's 8, she said quietly. "We've been trying to figure out what happened to us for 2 years. I felt like the ground was tilting under my feet. "What do you mean, what happened to us?" The woman pulled out her phone and showed me a photo that made me grab the side of her van for support. It was a playground photo with at least 10 sets of identical twin girls, all different ages, all with the exact same face as my daughters. "We call ourselves the Mirror Mothers," she said, putting her phone away. "There are 37 families that we know about so far, all with identical twin girls who look exactly the same no matter what year they were born." She pressed a business card into my hand with just a phone number on it. "Call Belle tonight. She's been investigating this for 3 years. The woman grabbed her daughter's hands and started walking away but turned back. "Did you use fertility treatments?" I shook my head because I'd gotten pregnant naturally. "Check your bank records from 2019. We all thought we got pregnant naturally too." I abandoned my errands and drove straight home. Charlie was at work and the twins were at preschool and I had 2 hours to figure out what was happening. I found our bank statements from 2019, and there it was. A $30,000 withdrawal I didn't remember labeled medical expenses. My hands shook as I called the number on the card. "Is this about the twins?" A woman answered immediately. "Yes," I said. "I just saw another pair at the gas station." Belle sighed like she'd had this conversation before. "Can you meet me right now? Don't go to the preschool first. Just meet me at the coffee shop on 3rd. I drove there in a daze and found Belle sitting with 5 other women at a corner table. They all looked up when I walked in and I could see they'd all been crying. "Sit down," Belle said. "What I'm about to show you is going to change everything." She opened her laptop and turned it toward me. On the screen was a medical document with my name on it from a clinic I'd never heard of. "Reproductive Health Solutions." "I've never been to any fertility clinic," I said. But Belle was already pulling up more documents. "You have. We all have. Look at the signatures." She showed me consent form after consent form with my signature, all dated during a 3-week period in 2019 that felt fuzzy in my memory. "I was visiting my sick mother that month," I said. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure. Belle clicked to another file. "Every single one of us has the same gap in our memories. 3 weeks we can't quite remember, always with some excuse for why we were away. But even if we all had fertility treatments, that doesn't explain why all the children look identical," I said. Belle's face darkened. "No, it doesn't. And that's where it gets worse." She pulled up a missing persons database and typed in a name. A photo loaded that made every mother at the table gasp. It was our daughter's face, but on a woman who'd gone missing in 2018. Her name was Ariana Miley. She was 20 when she disappeared. She had an identical twin sister who also vanished the same day. My phone started ringing and it was the preschool. "Mrs. Steck, we're calling about Taylor and Delia," the voice said, but it didn't sound like their usual teacher. "There's been an incident and we need you to come pick them up immediately." "What kind of incident?" I asked, but Belle was already shaking her head and mouthing, "Don't go," at me. "Your daughters are fine, but there's been a gas leak and we're evacuating," the voice said. I knew the preschool's evacuation protocol, and they never called parents because they took the kids to the church next door. "I'll be right there," I lied and hung up. Belle was already on her phone. "They're moving on us," she said to someone. "Pack up now." Another mother at the table was typing frantically. "My neighbor just texted that there are black SUVs at my house," she said. Belle slammed her laptop shut. "Everyone get your twins and run. Don't go home. Don't go to their schools." But my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was a photo of Taylor and Delia in a white room I'd never seen before, sitting next to 2 young women who looked exactly like them but 20 years older. And one of them was holding up a sign that said, "Stop looking or we take them all back." I stared at the photo on my phone and my hands started shaking so bad I almost dropped it. The white room looked like a doctor's office or maybe a lab, and Taylor and Delia were sitting on a bench looking confused but not scared. The 2 women next to them had their exact faces but older, like looking at my daughters in 20 years, and one of them held up that sign telling me to stop looking, or they'd take them all back. Belle grabbed my arm hard and pulled me toward the door. "We need to leave right now," she said. "They know we're here." I followed her out to the parking lot, still staring at the photo, trying to understand how someone had my daughters when they were supposed to be at preschool. Belle unlocked her car and practically shoved me into the passenger seat before running around to the driver's side. The other mothers from the coffee shop scattered to their own cars, and I watched them all drive away in different directions like they'd practiced this before. Belle started driving fast through side streets while I pulled out my phone and called Ronald. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. My breath was coming in short gasps, and I kept seeing that photo in my head. My babies in that white room with those women who looked like them. Belle turned down another street and I called Ronald a 3rd time, my finger shaking on the screen. What if someone was already at our house? What if they'd gone there looking for me? Belle glanced over and told me to keep trying, her voice calm even though she was driving like we were being chased. I hit redial again and again, watching the phone ring and ring, panic flooding through me so strong I felt sick. Ronald finally answered on my 6th call and he sounded annoyed. What's wrong, Beth? I'm in a meeting. I tried to explain about the photo, but my words came out jumbled and he asked me to slow down. I forced myself to speak clearly and told him someone had Taylor and Delia. Someone took a picture of them in a white room. There was a long silence on the other end. Beth, are you feeling okay? He asked and his tone made me want to scream. The girls are at preschool, remember? You dropped them off this morning. I told him about the photo and the threatening message and he went quiet again. Have you been drinking? He finally said, and my blood boiled. I'm completely sober, I said through clenched teeth. Someone is threatening our daughters and you're asking if I'm drunk? He sighed like I was being difficult and said he was at work and everything was fine and maybe I should go home and rest. I hung up on him. Belle pulled into a parking lot behind a library and turned off the car. She reached into her bag and pulled out her own phone, scrolling through old messages. Look, she said, showing me a text from 2 years ago. It was almost identical to mine. A photo of her daughters in a white room with adult lookalikes and a threatening message. She scrolled through more messages, showing me a pattern of surveillance and intimidation going back years. They use fear to keep us isolated, Belle explained. They want us too scared to talk to each other or investigate. But in 3 years, they've never actually taken anyone's children. It's all threats designed to make us panic and do something stupid. I stared at the messages, feeling my heart rate start to slow down a little. The preschool had confirmed there was no gas leak, which meant someone had called pretending to be staff to try to make me rush over there in a panic. I forced myself to breathe slowly and think clearly instead of just reacting in fear. What did I actually know for certain? My daughters were at preschool where I'd dropped them off this morning. The photo could have been taken any time, maybe even faked somehow. The threatening message was meant to scare me into doing something predictable, like running to the school or going home alone. Belle was right that they wanted me isolated and panicking. I looked at her and asked what I should do. She said the first step was to stop reacting emotionally to every new shock and start thinking strategically. They wanted me scared and alone, so I needed to stay calm and work with the other mothers. Belle pulled out a worn notebook filled with handwritten notes and showed me pages of detailed records. The Mirror Group had been tracking surveillance patterns for 3 years, documenting when families received threats and what triggered them. She showed me a list of safety protocols they'd developed, including code words for school pickups, and rotating who retrieved children so the same person wasn't predictable. There were notes about which families had been followed and when, patterns of escalation that happened after certain actions. She explained that every mother in the group had been through this initial panic phase, and they'd learned that documentation and preparation were better than fear. I read through the pages, seeing how organized and systematic they'd become. I realized I needed to stop just reacting to each new piece of information and start documenting everything myself. Belle handed me a fresh notebook from her bag and told me to write down every detail I could remember. I started with the gas station encounter, describing the woman and her daughters, what we'd talked about, the photo she'd shown me. I wrote about finding the bank statement, the medical expenses I didn't remember, calling Belle and coming to the coffee shop. I documented the fake preschool call, the threatening text, every detail I could think of. Writing it down made it feel more real, but also more manageable, like something I could understand and fight against instead of just being terrified. Belle started the car and said we should go pick up my daughters together using the safety protocols. We drove to the preschool and I went inside to talk to the director while Belle waited in the parking lot. I explained that I needed to add someone to my authorized pickup list and establish a code word for emergencies. The director looked concerned but agreed, and I gave her Belle's name and chose a code word that only Taylor and Delia would know. Then I brought Belle inside and introduced her and we went to the classroom together. My daughters saw me and came running over, completely happy and unaware of any danger. I hugged them so tight they squirmed and asked why I was squeezing so hard. I told them I just missed them and helped them gather their things. Belle followed us home in her own car and came inside while I got the girls settled with snacks and turned on cartoons. She did a quick walk through our house, checking windows and doors, looking for anything obviously wrong. Everything seemed normal, but she suggested I change the locks as soon as possible and install a basic camera system. She wrote down the name of a security company that several Mirror mothers had used and said they were good about being discreet. I thanked her for everything, and she gave me her personal cell number, telling me to call anytime, day or night, if anything else happened. She was leaving just as Ronald's car pulled into the driveway. Ronald came in looking shaken and defensive. his tie loose and his face pale. Belle calmly introduced herself as someone helping families affected by reproductive health solutions, and I watched his reaction carefully. His face went completely white when she said the clinic name, and for just a second I saw guilt flash across his features before he covered it with confusion. "What are you talking about?" he asked, but his voice wasn't steady. Belle looked at me and said she'd let us talk privately, then left through the front door. Ronald stood in the hallway staring at me, and I realized he knew something he hadn't told me. The question was how much he knew and why he'd kept it secret. I walked straight to Ronald and closed the door behind us, my hands shaking as I held the bank statement. He looked confused and worried, probably wondering why Belle just introduced herself with that clinic name, and I didn't give him time to make excuses. I asked him directly if he knew anything about the $30,000 or reproductive health solutions, watching his face carefully for any sign that he was hiding something from me. He shook his head immediately and said we got pregnant naturally, that I must be confused or mixing things up with someone else's story. His voice had that careful tone he uses when he thinks I'm being irrational, the same one he used when I wanted to quit my job after the twins were born, and it made my blood boil. I shoved the bank statement at him and told him to look at the date, to look at his own signature authorizing the withdrawal. He stared at the paper for what felt like forever, his face going pale as he traced the numbers with his finger. Finally, he admitted he remembered me being gone for a few weeks that spring, something about visiting my sick mother in another state. I felt my stomach drop because my mother wasn't sick in 2019. She was perfectly healthy and living 2 hours away, and I would never leave my 4-month-old twins for weeks to visit her. Ronald kept staring at the statement like it might change if he looked long enough, and I realized he genuinely didn't remember either. We both had this fuzzy gap in our memories from the same time period, and that scared me more than anything else that had happened today. That night, I couldn't sleep even though I was exhausted from the emotional chaos. I waited until Taylor and Delia were down for the night, checking on them 3 times to make sure they were really asleep and safe. Then I went to our home office and started pulling up everything I could find from 2019. Old emails loaded slowly on my laptop, and I scrolled through months of messages looking for anything about a trip or medical appointments. There was almost nothing useful, just some generic emails about grocery pickup, and a few messages to friends saying I was busy with the twins. I found photos from that time period showing Taylor and Delia as tiny babies, but none of the pictures had dates or locations that proved where I actually was. My calendar from 2019 had some appointments marked, but they were vague entries like doctor or errands that could mean anything. I searched through our credit card statements looking for hotel charges or plane tickets, but there was nothing except normal purchases at local stores. It was like those 3 weeks had been carefully erased from every record, leaving just enough generic evidence that I couldn't prove they never happened. I pulled out old photo albums and tried to remember taking specific pictures, but my memories felt slippery and uncertain. The harder I tried to grab onto concrete details, the more they seemed to slide away from me. I found myself staring at a photo of me holding the twins on what was supposedly my birthday that year, but I couldn't remember the actual day or who took the picture. Ronald came in around midnight and found me surrounded by papers and old photos, tears running down my face. He sat next to me without saying anything, and we both just looked at the evidence of time we couldn't remember living through. I lay in bed that night replaying every memory I had from 2019, trying to find something solid I could hold on to. I remembered the twins being born in January. That part was clear and real with specific details about the hospital and the nurses. But after that first few months, things got fuzzy in a way that didn't make sense. I should remember every day with my newborn babies, every feeding and diaper change and sleepless night, but instead I had this vague sense of time passing without actual memories attached to it. Ronald was asleep next to me, his breathing slow and steady, but I felt completely alone with this growing horror. Weeks of my life were just missing, replaced with a story about visiting my mother that never actually happened. I got up and checked on Taylor and Delia again, standing in their doorway watching them sleep in their matching beds. They looked so peaceful and innocent, and I thought about how someone had violated my body while I was unconscious to create them. I loved them completely, and they were my daughters in every way that mattered, but their existence was tied to a crime I couldn't even fully remember. I went back to bed and stared at the ceiling until dawn started creeping through the windows, my mind going in circles trying to understand how this could have happened to me. The next morning, I called Belle as soon as the twins were occupied with breakfast and cartoons. She answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting for my call, and I told her about the memory gap and how Ronald couldn't remember that time clearly either. Belle sighed and said every single mirror mother has reported the exact same experience. 3 weeks in 2019 that feel like looking through fog. She explained that they've been working with a neurologist who specializes in drug-induced amnesia, someone who's been consulting with their group quietly for the past year. Belle gave me his name and office number, saying he's been helping them understand how someone could have erased weeks of memories while implanting false ones about being away. She warned me that getting those memories back might not be possible, that some types of amnesia drugs cause permanent gaps that can never be recovered. I wrote down the neurologist's information with shaking hands and thanked her for everything she was doing to help us. Belle told me not to lose hope, that even without the memories, we had enough evidence to prove what happened and hold someone accountable. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen listening to my daughters laugh at their show in the next room, and I made a decision to fight for them no matter what it took. I called my sister and asked if she could watch the girls for the day, making up something about urgent errands I needed to run. She agreed immediately because she's always happy to spend time with her nieces, but I could hear the concern in her voice when she asked if everything was okay. I told her I'd explain soon, which was true, but also a way to avoid the conversation I wasn't ready to have yet. She came over within an hour, and the twins were excited to see their aunt, running to hug her legs as soon as she walked in. My sister looked at me closely and said I seemed stressed. Was I taking care of myself? Did I need help with anything? I almost broke down right there and told her everything, but I couldn't put that burden on her when I barely understood it myself. Instead, I just hugged her and said I appreciated her watching the girls, that I'd be back by dinner time. Taylor and Delia barely noticed when I left because they were already pulling out toys to show their aunt, and I was grateful they were too young to sense how scared I was. Belle picked me up at the corner near my house, and we drove across town to a park with open fields where we could see anyone approaching from far away. She explained that the Mirror mothers had learned to be careful about meeting locations after a few families reported being followed by unmarked cars. We parked near the playground and walked to a picnic table where 3 other women were already waiting, all of them looking as tired and scared as I felt. Belle introduced me using just my first name, and the women nodded in understanding, not offering their own names right away. We sat down, and one of the mothers started talking about her experience, how she'd found the same mysterious medical charge in her bank records, and had the same fuzzy memories from 2019. Another woman described getting threatening messages after she started asking questions, photos of her daughters at the school with warnings to stop investigating. The third mother showed me pictures on her phone of her twins who were 8 years old, and I stared at faces that could have been Taylor and Delia in a few years. Every detail they shared matched my own experience so perfectly, it was like hearing my own story told by different people. We compared our bank statements and found that all the withdrawals had gone through the same medical billing company, the one that no longer existed. The similarities were overwhelming and chilling, making it impossible to dismiss this as coincidence or mistake. One of the mothers pulled out her phone and scrolled to her daughter's baby photos, then held it next to pictures I showed her of Taylor and Delia as newborns. The babies in both photos could have been the same children, identical down to the shape of their ears and the exact shade of their hair. We all stared at the images in silence because seeing it like that made the whole thing undeniable and real. Another mother's twins were 8 years old, and she showed me current photos of them at a soccer game. Their faces mature, but still clearly the same as my daughter's faces. Looking at those older girls felt like seeing into the future, like watching Taylor and Delia grow up and fast forward, and my stomach twisted with the wrongness of it all. The mother with the 8-year-old said quietly that at least our daughters had each other, that they'd never be alone even when they learned the truth about how they came to exist. I thought about that and realized she was right, that Taylor and Delia would always have their twin no matter what else happened. But it also meant they'd both carry the same burden of knowing their existence came from someone's crime against me, and possibly against Ariana Miley. Belle waited until we'd all shared our stories before explaining what she'd learned over her 3 years of investigating. She said they'd been trying to work quietly to avoid spooking whoever was behind this, gathering evidence and connecting families without drawing attention. But the threatening messages had been getting worse lately, more frequent and more specific, which meant someone was watching them closely and getting nervous. Belle thought it was time to bring in legal help and possibly law enforcement, even though she knew some mothers were scared of losing custody if authorities decided we were unstable or unfit. One of the women at the table started crying and said she couldn't risk her daughters being taken away, that she'd rather live in fear than lose them to the system. Another mother argued that staying quiet was more dangerous, that whoever did this to us was still out there and might do it to other women. Belle listened to both sides and then said firmly that she believed we were stronger together than scattered and silent, that collective action was our best protection. I found myself agreeing with her because hiding felt like letting them win, like accepting what they'd done to us without fighting back. A car pulled into the parking lot and we all tensed until we saw it was just a woman with a legal briefcase getting out. Belle stood up and waved her over, introducing her as Henrietta May, an attorney who specializes in medical malpractice and reproductive rights. Henrietta was probably in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, and she had this calm confidence that made me feel slightly less panicked. She sat down at our picnic table and pulled out a yellow legal pad, asking each of us to tell her our stories from the beginning. Henrietta listened without interrupting or showing shock, just taking detailed notes and occasionally asking specific questions about dates or documents. She wanted to know exact amounts of the bank withdrawals, whether we'd kept the threatening messages, if any of us had tried to contact the clinic directly. When we'd all finished talking, Henrietta looked at her notes for a long moment before speaking. She explained that if we were drugged and subjected to medical procedures without informed consent, that constituted both criminal assault and grounds for major civil litigation. Her voice was matter of fact but not cold, like she was explaining serious crimes while also acknowledging our humanity as victims. Henrietta said the first step was securing our children's safety through protective orders, while building a case with documented evidence, and she asked if we were willing to let her represent us as a group. I looked around the table at the other mothers' faces and saw my own determination reflected back at me, and I knew we were all thinking the same thing about protecting our daughters no matter what it cost us. Henrietta pulled a thick folder from her briefcase and spread several documents across the picnic table in front of us. She pointed to the first page and explained that what happened to us qualified as criminal assault because someone drugged us and performed medical procedures without our real consent. The forged signatures on those consent forms didn't matter because we were incapacitated when we supposedly signed them. She said we also had grounds for major civil lawsuits against the clinic and anyone involved in funding or operating it. Her voice stayed calm and professional as she outlined our options, making the whole nightmare feel slightly more manageable because someone finally understood how serious this was. Henrietta explained that the first step was securing protective orders for our children, while building a documented case with medical records and financial evidence. She asked if I was ready to let her represent me officially, and I nodded before she even finished the question. She slid a stack of forms across the table and handed me a pen, explaining each document as I signed. The authorization forms would let her request my complete medical records from any facility that might have treated me. Henrietta warned that filing these requests would likely trigger a response from whoever was monitoring us because they'd know we were taking legal action. She said we needed to move quickly on multiple fronts before they could destroy evidence or intimidate us into backing down. That afternoon, Henrietta drove to her office downtown while I followed in my car, and I watched her march into the building with her briefcase like she was going to war for us. She filed formal requests for my complete medical records from Reproductive Health Solutions and every clinic affiliated with them in the state. Henrietta also sent a certified letter to the clinic demanding they preserve all documents related to my case, which she explained created a legal obligation they couldn't ignore without facing serious penalties. She called me an hour later to confirm everything was filed and said the clock was ticking now. I sat in my car in the parking lot staring at my phone and trying to process that I'd just officially started a legal battle against people who'd violated my body and created my children through some twisted experiment. I drove home rehearsing how to tell Ronald everything I'd learned because I knew he'd resist believing it at first. He was in the kitchen making coffee when I walked in, and he smiled at me before noticing my expression. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos Belle had given me of all the identical twin girls from different families. Ronald stared at the screen and his face went pale as he scrolled through image after image of children who looked exactly like Taylor and Delia. He kept saying this couldn't be real, and asking if someone photoshopped the pictures as some kind of sick joke. I showed him the bank statement with the $30,000 withdrawal, and the medical documents with my forged signature. Ronald sat down heavily at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands, and I could see him starting to believe it despite every part of him wanting to reject it. He looked up at me with this sick expression and asked what we were supposed to do now. I told him about Henrietta and the legal case we were building, and he just nodded slowly like he was in shock. Ronald was quiet for a long time before he admitted something that made my stomach drop. He said he'd been getting strange calls at work over the past few months from someone asking about our family situation. The caller wanted to know if we were satisfied with our fertility outcomes and if we had any concerns about our daughter's health or development. Ronald thought it was just some weird marketing survey and hung up after the first few questions, but now he realized they were checking on us. I felt anger rising in my chest because he'd never mentioned these calls before, but I pushed it down because getting mad wouldn't help anything. I asked if he remembered any other details about the calls, and he said the person always called from a blocked number and sounded professional like they were reading from a script. We went upstairs to where Taylor and Delia were playing with blocks in their room, and I knelt down to their level with a smile I didn't feel. I told them we were going to play a new safety game where they had to hear a special code word from anyone who wanted to pick them up from the school. Ronald suggested using their favorite cartoon character's name, and the girls got excited about having a secret password. I made them practice saying the code word back to me and explaining that they couldn't go with anyone who didn't say it first, even if it was someone they knew. Delia asked if this included Grandma, and I said yes. It included everyone until Mommy or Daddy told them the game was over. The girls thought it was fun and went back to their blocks, completely unaware that I was trying to protect them from people who might try to take them away. That evening, Belle called while I was making dinner, and I stepped out onto the back porch to talk privately. She said another mirror mother just received a threatening letter at her workplace warning her to stop asking questions about the clinic. The letter didn't make any specific threats, but the message was clear, and the woman was terrified because now her coworkers knew something strange was happening with her family. Belle said the mirror mothers were meeting tomorrow to coordinate a unified response because she believed we were stronger together than scattered and afraid. I agreed to be there and asked what time, writing it down on my hand because I couldn't find paper. Belle's voice was steady, but I could hear the strain underneath, and I realized she'd been carrying this burden alone for 3 years before finding the rest of us. I barely slept that night, getting up 4 times to check that all the doors were locked and the windows were secure. Each time I walked past Taylor and Delia's room, I pushed their door open quietly to make sure they were safe in their beds. Every car that drove past our house made my heart race, and I found myself standing at the window watching headlights sweep across our yard. Ronald found me there at 2 in the morning and guided me back to bed, but I just lay there staring at the ceiling. I realized I couldn't live like this forever, jumping at every sound and imagining threats around every corner. Something had to change, or this fear would consume me completely. At the Mirror Mothers meeting the next day, we gathered at a different coffee shop across town, and Belle introduced us to a man named Stuart Garrett. Stuart was a forensic accountant who volunteered his time helping victims of financial crimes, and he had this calm confidence that made me feel like maybe we could actually figure out who was behind all this. He explained how to trace shell companies and hidden money flows, using words I didn't fully understand but trusting that he knew what he was doing. Stuart said following the money was often the best way to identify the people pulling the strings, because eventually every transaction led back to a real person or organization. He pulled out a laptop and showed us examples of corporate structures designed to hide ownership, pointing out patterns we should look for in our own records. Stuart asked us all to bring every financial document we had from 2018 through 2020, including bank statements, credit card bills, and tax returns. He said patterns would emerge when we looked at multiple families' records together, especially if the same shell companies or billing entities showed up repeatedly. Stuart explained that whoever funded the clinic probably used the same financial infrastructure for all of us, which meant comparing our records could reveal connections we'd miss looking at them individually. I made a mental note to dig through our filing cabinet as soon as I got home because I wanted to give Stuart everything he needed. Belle thanked him for helping us, and he just shrugged and said, "Nobody should get away with doing this to families." I drove straight home and pulled every financial document from our filing cabinet, spreading bank statements and tax returns across the kitchen table. Ronald was still at work, and the girls wouldn't be home from preschool for another hour, giving me time to sort through 5 years of records without explaining what I was doing. I found receipts, credit card bills, and investment statements from 2018 through 2022, organizing them by year, and typed the way Stuart had explained. My hands moved automatically, scanning each page into the secure folder he'd set up, but my brain kept circling back to those consent forms with my signature. The $30,000 withdrawal stared at me from the 2019 statement, and I photographed it from 3 different angles to make sure Stuart could see every detail. Looking at the actual numbers made everything feel more solid and less like some crazy story I might have imagined. These were real transactions, real money that came out of our account, real evidence that something happened to me even if I couldn't remember it. My phone rang just as I finished uploading the last document and Stuart's name flashed on the screen. He didn't waste time on small talk, jumping straight into what he'd found in the records I'd sent earlier. The medical billing company that processed my $30,000 withdrawal was called Cascade Health Services, and it had been dissolved exactly 6 months after my payment went through. Stuart explained that legitimate medical billing companies don't just disappear like that, especially not ones handling fertility treatments that require years of follow-up care. He'd run the company's tax identification number through several databases, and found it was created 3 months before my withdrawal, and shut down 9 months later, which meant it existed for less than a year total. That wasn't a real business, he said. That was a shell company set up specifically to move money and hide the source. Stuart kept talking, his voice getting more excited as he traced the connections deeper. Cascade Health Services was owned by a parent corporation called Meridian Biotech Holdings, which was itself owned by another company, and that company was owned by another one in a chain that went back 5 levels. He said this kind of corporate structure was designed to hide who actually controlled the money and made decisions, creating so many layers that investigators would give up trying to follow the trail. But he'd spent all afternoon mapping it out, and at the very top of the ownership chain was a private investment firm with direct ties to Reproductive Health Solutions. The same clinic that had my forged consent forms was connected through this complicated web of shell companies to the billing company that took my money. Stuart said this level of hiding usually meant someone was protecting themselves from lawsuits or criminal charges, because honest businesses don't need 5 layers of corporate protection. The next morning, Henrietta called to say she'd received a response from Reproductive Health Solutions, and I could hear the anger in her voice before she even read me the letter. The clinic's lawyers had sent a formal reply stating they had no records of any patient named Beth Stockton, and suggesting I must be confused about where I received treatment. They claimed their patient privacy protocols were extremely strict, and they would never release information to third parties without proper authorization, which made it sound like Henrietta was the problem instead of them. The letter went on to say that making false accusations against medical facilities was a serious matter that could result in legal consequences for defamation, and they hoped I would reconsider my claims before taking any further action. Henrietta said this was classic gaslighting, trying to make me doubt my own evidence and scare me away from investigating. But she'd dealt with this kind of corporate intimidation before, and it usually meant they were hiding something big enough to fight over. Belle texted me that afternoon asking if I could talk securely, and I locked myself in the bedroom away from the girls. She said she'd been in contact with a former employee from Reproductive Health Solutions who was willing to talk about what happened at the clinic, but the woman was terrified of losing her nursing license or facing retaliation. Belle had been building trust with her for months, sharing information slowly, and proving that the Mirror Mothers were serious about getting justice. The woman finally agreed to meet in person, but only in a very public place where she could blend into crowds and leave quickly if she felt unsafe. Belle said this employee had worked in the procedure rooms and witnessed things that made her quit, and she'd been carrying guilt about staying silent for almost 3 years. Her name was Amira Singh, and Belle was setting up a meeting for tomorrow at the Westfield Mall during the busy lunch rush. We met Amira at the food court, choosing a table near the center where we could see everyone coming and going. She was a small woman in her 30s wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, even though we were indoors, and her eyes kept scanning the crowd like she expected someone to recognize her. Belle did most of the talking at first, thanking Amira for being brave enough to meet us and promising we'd protect her identity as much as possible. Amira pulled off her sunglasses and I could see she'd been crying, her eyes red and tired like she hadn't slept in days. She said she needed to tell someone what she'd seen because the guilt was eating her alive, and she couldn't let them keep doing this to women who trusted doctors to help them. Her hands shook as she described the clinic's procedures, explaining that women would come in thinking they were having routine fertility consultations to discuss their options. The clinic would offer them coffee or tea while they waited, Amira said, and the drinks were mixed with sedatives that kicked in within 15 minutes. The women would start feeling drowsy and confused, and staff would tell them it was normal to feel relaxed during the consultation. Then they'd be moved to procedure rooms where doctors would perform egg retrievals, while the patients were unconscious or too sedated to understand what was happening. Amira said the women would wake up hours later with vague memories of signing papers and talking to doctors, but they couldn't remember the actual procedures. The clinic told the staff this was an approved experimental protocol for reducing patient anxiety, and they claimed there was an ethics board that had reviewed and authorized everything. But Amira never saw any documentation from this supposed ethics board, and when she asked questions, her supervisor told her to focus on her job and trust that the doctors knew what they were doing. She described the embryo splitting process in detail that made my stomach turn. After harvesting eggs from sedated patients, the clinic would fertilize them and then use a technique to split the embryos into identical genetic copies. Amira said each embryo could be split into 4 or 5 copies that were genetically identical to each other, creating multiple embryos from a single fertilization. These copied embryos would then be implanted in different women during separate procedures, always creating twins because the clinic implanted 2 embryos per patient to increase success rates. That's why all our daughters were identical, she explained, because we all received embryos that came from the same original source and were split into copies. Amira quit when she realized the women weren't actually consenting to any of this, that they'd been drugged and manipulated into procedures they never agreed to undergo. I felt sick hearing her confirm that someone had violated my body while I was unconscious and unable to protect myself. My hands gripped the edge of the table and I had to focus on breathing slowly to keep from throwing up right there in the food court. Amira saw my reaction and reached across to touch my arm, her voice quiet and full of regret. She said she was sorry, that she should have reported what was happening years ago, but she was afraid of losing her nursing license and never working in medicine again. She'd convinced herself that maybe the women had consented to something she didn't understand, that maybe there was paperwork she hadn't seen that made it all legal. But watching the Mirror Mothers organization form and seeing families like mine trying to figure out what happened to them made her realize she couldn't stay silent anymore. Henrietta had been sitting quietly through all of this, taking notes on her phone and letting Amira tell her story without interruption. Now she leaned forward and asked if Amira would be willing to sign an affidavit describing everything she'd witnessed at the clinic. An affidavit was a sworn written statement that could be used as evidence in court, Henrietta explained, and it would mean Amira was officially going on record about the illegal procedures. Amira sat back and stared at her hands for a long moment, and I could see her weighing her career against doing what was right. She finally nodded and said yes, she would sign whatever Henrietta needed. She knew it would probably end her career in reproductive medicine, because no clinic would want to hire someone who testified against their industry. But she couldn't let them keep doing this to women, couldn't let more families go through what we were experiencing. Henrietta pulled out her laptop and started drafting the affidavit right there at the food court table, asking Amira specific questions about dates and procedures while people walked past us eating mall pretzels and shopping bags. Henrietta pulled out her laptop right there and started typing up the affidavit, while Amira answered her questions about specific dates and procedures. I sat there listening to Amira describe how they sedated women through drinks offered during consultations, how the procedures took 3 to 4 hours while patients were unconscious, how the staff was told this was approved research. My hands gripped my coffee cup so hard I thought it might break. We spent another hour at that table going over every detail Amira could remember before Henrietta printed the document at a nearby copy shop and had Amira sign it in front of a notary. Amira's hand shook as she wrote her name, and I knew she was giving up her whole career to help us. Over the next few days, Stuart called me 3 times with updates about what he was finding in the financial records. He traced the money from Reproductive Health Solutions back through 2 shell companies to a biotech investment firm called Meridian Genetics. I looked up Meridian online and found corporate language about genetic optimization research and improving human health outcomes, which sounded nice until you realized they were talking about creating identical children without anyone's permission. Stuart sent me a diagram showing how money flowed from Meridian to the shell companies to the clinic, and he said this kind of setup was designed specifically to hide who was really funding the operation. He found payments going out to at least 15 different fertility clinics across 6 states, which meant this wasn't just happening to us, but to women everywhere. Belle called me the same week with something she'd discovered about Ariana Miley. She'd been searching through old news articles and found a small story from 2017 about twin sisters who were egg donors at a fertility clinic in Ohio. The article mentioned their names, Ariana and her sister Sophia, and included a photo that made my breath stop. It was our daughter's faces on 2 young women standing outside a medical building. Belle had contacted the clinic pretending to be a journalist writing about egg donation, and they confirmed both sisters had been active donors until they suddenly stopped showing up in early 2018. The clinic filed missing person reports when the sisters didn't respond to calls or emails, but the police investigation went nowhere because there was no evidence of anything bad happening. Belle said both women vanished within 3 days of each other, and nobody ever figured out where they went. I sat on my couch staring at the photo Belle had sent me, and the understanding of what this meant felt like being crushed under something huge. Our daughters weren't just similar to Ariana because of some weird coincidence. They were genetic copies made from her stolen DNA, created in a lab and implanted in me while I was drugged and helpless. Someone had taken a missing woman's genetic material and used it to make dozens or maybe hundreds of identical children without telling anyone. I thought about Ariana and Sophia, 2 young women who'd been trying to help other people have babies by donating their eggs, and how they disappeared right when this whole thing started. My hands started shaking and I had to put my phone down. Taylor and Delia were playing with blocks in our living room, building a tower that kept falling over, and they were laughing every time the blocks crashed down. I watched them and felt this complicated mess of feelings I couldn't sort out. They were my daughters in every way that mattered. I'd carried them for 9 months, felt them kick inside me, stayed up all night when they were sick, taught them to walk and talk and use the bathroom, but their existence came from crimes committed against me, and probably against Ariana too. Someone had violated my body while I was unconscious, and someone had maybe hurt or killed a young woman to steal her DNA. I loved Taylor and Delia more than anything in the world, but knowing how they came to exist made me feel sick. Henrietta called that afternoon to say she was filing a police report on behalf of all the Mirror mothers. She had Amira's signed affidavit describing the illegal procedures, Stuart's financial documents showing the shell company connections, and statements from 30 families about the memory gaps and threatening messages. She said we had enough evidence now that the police couldn't ignore us, and she'd arranged for us to meet with a detective who handled complex cases. The meeting was scheduled for the next morning at the police station, and Henrietta told me to bring Ronald if he was willing to come. Ronald took the morning off work and we drove to the station together in silence. The detective's name was Quentin Aldrich, and he looked like he was in his 50s with gray hair and tired eyes. He listened to Henrietta present all our evidence without saying much, just taking notes and asking a few questions about dates and locations. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. He said this would be an extremely hard case to investigate because it involved multiple states and possibly federal crimes like human trafficking and medical fraud. He couldn't promise us quick results because these things took months or even years to build properly. But he looked at Amira's affidavit and Stuart's financial documents and said the evidence was strong enough that he agreed it needed a full investigation. He told us to keep documenting everything and to be extra careful about our safety because people who committed crimes like this usually didn't want to be exposed. That night, I woke up to a loud beeping sound and Ronald shaking my shoulder. Our new security system was going off and the alarm company was calling to ask if we were okay. Ronald ran downstairs and looked out the window, and he said he saw someone running away from our back door toward the street. The police came within 10 minutes, but they didn't find anyone in the area, and the officer said whoever it was had run off when the alarm started. I was shaking so hard my teeth were chattering, and Ronald had to hold me up while the police checked our whole house to make sure nobody had gotten inside. The officer found marks on our back door like someone had been trying to pry it open, and he took photos for his report. After the police left, I couldn't stop shaking, and Ronald sat with me on the couch until the sun came up because I was too scared to go back to sleep. Belle called the next morning when she heard about the break-in attempt. She said we should think about temporarily moving in with other Mirror mothers who had better security, maybe someone with a house that had a full alarm system and cameras everywhere. I told her I didn't want to pull Taylor and Delia out of their home and their normal routine because they were already dealing with enough stress from sensing that something was wrong. Belle understood but said we needed to add more protection. So that afternoon, Ronald took another day off, and we had a security company install additional cameras covering every angle of our house and motion sensors on all the windows. The company also put in better locks on all the doors and gave us panic buttons we could press if we needed help. Ronald told his boss he was taking the whole next week off to stay home with us, and for once his company didn't give him trouble about it. The break-in attempt changed something in Ronald. He stopped questioning whether I was overreacting or making things too big, and he started really helping with the investigation instead of just going along with it. He pulled out all his old records and went through them looking for anything that might be useful, and he found some credit card statements from 2019 that showed charges at restaurants and stores near where the clinic used to be. He also started remembering more details about that time, like how I'd seemed tired and confused when I came back from wherever I'd been, and how I'd had some bruising on my arms that I'd said came from bumping into things. He felt terrible that he hadn't questioned it more back then, but I told him none of us understood what was happening. Quentin called a few days later to say the police were opening a formal investigation into reproductive health solutions and Meridian Genetics. He said they were coordinating with federal agencies because the crimes crossed state lines, and they'd be interviewing other mirror mothers and trying to find more witnesses like Amira. He warned us that opening a formal investigation would probably make whoever was behind this more desperate, and we should expect them to try harder to scare us into staying quiet. He told us to call him immediately if anything else happened, and he gave us his personal cell phone number in case we needed to reach him after hours. I thanked him and hung up, feeling both relieved that someone official was finally taking this seriously and terrified about what might happen next. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived by certified mail requiring my signature, and when I opened it, I found legal letterhead from a firm I'd never heard of representing reproductive health solutions. The letter said I was making false accusations that damaged their reputation, and if I didn't stop immediately, they would sue me for defamation and seek damages in excess of $1 million. My hands shook so badly I could barely read the rest of it, which went into detail about how my claims were unsubstantiated and malicious, and how they had witnesses who would testify I was never a patient at their facility. I called Henrietta right away, and she asked me to scan the letter and send it to her, then told me not to worry, because this was a standard intimidation tactic used by people trying to scare victims into silence. She said we had evidence on our side, and they were the ones who should be worried about lawsuits, not us. Over the next few days, Belle started getting calls from other mirror mothers who'd received the exact same threatening letter from the same law firm, all demanding we stop our investigation or face legal action. Belle organized an emergency video call with everyone, and Henrietta joined to explain our rights and why we shouldn't back down. Henrietta said the letters proved we were getting close to something they wanted hidden, and the best response was to stand together and refuse to be silenced. She drafted a joint statement for all of us asserting our right to investigate crimes committed against us and demanding accountability for what had been done to our families. We all signed the statement, and Henrietta sent it back to the law firm, making it clear we weren't going to stop looking for answers just because they tried to threaten us. A few days after that, Belle got a call from a local journalist who said he'd heard rumors about a fertility clinic investigation and wanted to know if we'd be willing to talk to him. Belle immediately called Henrietta to discuss whether we should go public with our story, and Henrietta said media attention might actually protect us by making it harder for anyone to harm us quietly. We held another group meeting to decide together, and most of the mothers agreed that staying silent hadn't kept us safe, so maybe it was time to let people know what was happening to us. The consensus was that we should do the interview but be very careful not to name our children or show their faces, focusing instead on the medical violations and financial fraud. Belle coordinated with Henrietta about what we could and couldn't say legally, and then 3 of us, including me, met with the journalist at a neutral location. We told him about the memory gaps and the mysterious medical charges and the threatening messages, showing him some of the documentation Stewart had gathered about the shell companies. The journalist took careful notes and recorded our conversation, and he seemed genuinely shocked by what we were describing. He promised to verify everything we told him before publishing, and to protect our children's identities. A week later, the story ran in the local paper with the headline, "Local Mothers Allege Fertility Clinic Conspiracy," and suddenly we weren't alone anymore. The article laid out the basic facts about the 37 families with identical daughters and the evidence of unauthorized medical procedures, and it included quotes from Henrietta about the legal violations. Within hours of the article going online, Belle's phone started ringing with calls from people who'd experienced similar things, and by the end of the day, 3 more families had come forward with the same memory gaps and mysterious medical charges from 2019. Each new family that joined us made our case stronger and harder to dismiss as just coincidence or confusion, and the Mirror Mothers Network grew to over 40 families in just a few days. The new families brought their own documentation and memories, adding more pieces to the puzzle we were trying to solve. One mother had saved emails from the clinic that contradicted their claims about never treating patients, and another had credit card receipts from restaurants near the facility during her missing 3 weeks. Quentin called Belle a few days after the article came out to say the police had obtained a warrant to search the old Reproductive Health Solutions facility, which was now operating under a different name doing regular fertility treatments. He couldn't share details about what they were finding during the search, but his tone suggested they were discovering significant evidence that supported our claims. He told Belle to let all the Mirror mothers know that the investigation was moving forward, and we should continue documenting everything. Stewart called me that same week to say he'd traced a series of payments from the biotech firm to a private security company, which finally explained how they'd been monitoring and intimidating us for so long. The security company specialized in surveillance and asset protection, and the payments lined up perfectly with when different Mirror mothers had reported being followed or receiving threats. Henrietta added this information to our growing evidence file, and said it might be enough to get restraining orders against both the biotech firm and the security company. A few weeks later, I got a formal notice to appear before a grand jury to testify about my experience with reproductive health solutions. Henrietta prepared me for what to expect, explaining that I would be alone in the room with the jurors and a prosecutor, and I should just tell the truth about what happened to me. Walking into that courthouse was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, knowing I was about to describe the memory gap and the threatening messages to a room full of strangers. I sat in the witness chair and forced myself to stay calm and factual as the prosecutor asked me questions about 2019 and the bank withdrawal and everything that had happened since I met the woman at the gas station. The grand jurors listened carefully, and some of them took notes, and a few asked their own questions about the threatening photo and whether I felt safe at home. I told them everything I could remember, trying to keep my voice steady even though my heart was beating. So fast I thought they could probably hear it. After about an hour, they thanked me and I left, feeling drained but relieved that I'd gotten through it. 2 weeks later, Quentin called to tell us the grand jury had voted to indict 3 executives from Reproductive Health Solutions on charges including assault, fraud, and conspiracy. He said this was a major step forward in holding people accountable for what they'd done to us, though he warned that the legal process would take months or years to fully resolve. The indictments meant the case was moving from investigation to prosecution, and the executives would have to face trial for their crimes. With criminal charges finally filed, Henrietta shifted her focus to building our civil case for damages and helping us secure permanent protective orders against anyone connected to the clinic. She explained that we would probably never get full justice for what had been done to us, but we could at least get safety for our families and financial compensation for the harm we'd suffered. Ronald and I started going to therapy together 3 weeks after the grand jury indictments came down. Our therapist was a woman in her 50s who specialized in trauma, and she had us sit on opposite ends of a couch in her office that smelled like lavender. The first session was awkward because Ronald kept insisting he didn't remember anything about 2019 either, and I kept wanting to blame him for not protecting us, even though I knew that wasn't fair. The therapist asked us both to describe what we lost when we found out about the clinic, and I started crying when I realized I'd lost my sense of safety and my own memories. Ronald admitted he felt like he'd failed as a husband and father, which was the first time he'd said anything that vulnerable since this whole thing started. Over the next few weeks, the therapist helped us see that we were both victims of the same crime, just in different ways. She explained that my anger at Ronald was really anger at the people who did this to us, and his defensiveness was shame about not being able to fix it. We started doing homework assignments where we had to tell each other one thing we appreciated about how the other person was handling the situation, which felt stupid at first but actually helped. By the second month, we were holding hands during sessions instead of sitting on opposite ends of the couch. At home, Taylor and Delia went to preschool and played with their toys and asked for snacks like nothing had changed. I watched them carefully for signs that they sensed the tension, but they seemed completely fine. They didn't know about the threatening messages or the court case or the fact that their genetic material came from a missing woman. I was grateful every single day that they were too young to understand any of it. Sometimes I would look at their faces and feel this complicated mix of love and grief, knowing what had been done to create them, but also knowing they were real children who deserved normal, happy lives. I hoped they would never have to carry the burden of knowing how they came into the world, that we could protect them from that knowledge at least. Ronald and I agreed we wouldn't tell them anything until they were much older, if ever, and we made sure to keep their routines exactly the same no matter what was happening with the legal case. The Mirror Mothers group met every 2 weeks at different locations, and at one meeting, Belle announced she wanted to formalize us into a real organization. She'd been talking to lawyers about setting up a nonprofit focused on supporting affected families and pushing for stronger laws around reproductive rights. Everyone agreed it was a good idea because we needed structure and funding if we were going to help families beyond just our own group. Belle drafted bylaws and filed paperwork with the state, and within 3 months we had official nonprofit status. The organization was called the Mirror Mothers Coalition, and Belle became the executive director because she'd been investigating this for 3 years and knew more than anyone. She channeled all that knowledge into building something that could last beyond our individual cases, creating resources for families and working with lawmakers on policy changes. We set up a website and a hotline, and almost immediately we started getting calls from families in other states who'd had similar experiences. Belle hired a part-time assistant to help manage the workload, and suddenly we weren't just victims anymore, we were advocates. I volunteered to help other families navigate the legal process because I'd learned so much from my own experience with Henrietta. When new families called the hotline scared and confused, I could tell them exactly what to expect and what documents to gather. I explained how to find a good lawyer and what questions to ask the police and how to protect their children while the investigation happened. Helping others gave me a sense of purpose that went beyond just keeping Taylor and Delia safe. Every time I walked a new mother through the steps, I felt like I was taking back some power from the people who hurt us. One woman called me crying because she'd just found the bank withdrawal and didn't know what to do, and I stayed on the phone with her for 2 hours helping her make a plan. Another mother needed help understanding the legal documents her lawyer sent, so I met her at a coffee shop and went through everything line by line. It felt good to use what I'd learned to make the journey less scary for other people. 6 months after that day at the gas station when I first saw Hattie and her daughters, a thick envelope arrived from the biotech firm's insurance company. Inside was a settlement offer for $800,000, which was more money than Ronald and I had ever seen in one place. The letter said the payment was contingent on signing a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent us from talking about the case publicly or joining any class action lawsuits. I called Henrietta immediately, and she told me not to sign anything. She explained that the insurance company was trying to pick off families one by one with individual settlements that included gag orders, which would make it harder to hold the company accountable publicly. The money was tempting because we had legal bills and therapy costs, and I'd cut back my work hours to deal with everything. But Henrietta said we'd likely get more in a class action anyway. More importantly, she reminded me that staying silent would mean other families might go through the same thing without warning. I talked to Ronald about it that night after the girls were in bed, and he admitted the money would solve a lot of our immediate problems. We could pay off the credit cards and fix the car, and maybe even put some away for the twins' college fund. But then he said he didn't think he could live with himself if we took money to stay quiet while the clinic kept operating under a different name. We called Belle and found out that several other families had received similar offers, and she was organizing a group response. At the next Mirror Mothers meeting, we all agreed to refuse the individual settlements and pursue a class action lawsuit instead. Henrietta's legal team estimated it would take 3 years to fully resolve, but we were committed to transparency over quick money. We signed a joint statement saying we wouldn't accept any settlement that included non-disclosure agreements, and Henrietta filed the class action paperwork on behalf of 42 families. The insurance company wasn't happy, but we'd made our choice. A few weeks later, Quentin called with an update that made me sit down hard in a kitchen chair. The criminal investigation had expanded to include Ariana Miley's disappearance, and they'd found evidence at the old clinic site suggesting her genetic material had been harvested and stored there. He couldn't give me all the details because it was an active investigation, but he said Ariana's family was finally getting some answers after years of not knowing what happened to her. The police had also connected the clinic to a network that trafficked genetic material from vulnerable women, often targeting those who were already in difficult situations. Quentin explained that the executives being prosecuted weren't just guilty of what they did to us. They were part of something much bigger and darker. Knowing that our case might help solve Ariana's disappearance made the whole thing feel more important, like maybe something good could come from all this pain. Ronald came home one evening and told me he'd gotten a new job with better hours and better pay. His old company had been understanding about all the court dates and therapy appointments, but the schedule was unpredictable, and he was missing too much of the girls' lives. The new position was Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, with no weekend shifts or late nights. He'd be home for dinner every night and available for school pickups when needed. We slowly started rebuilding trust through consistent honesty and shared therapy sessions, learning to talk about hard things instead of avoiding them. Our marriage wasn't what it was before all this happened, but we were creating something different that might actually be stronger. We'd both been through trauma and come out the other side still choosing each other, which felt like an accomplishment. Some nights we'd sit on the couch after the girls were asleep and just talk about normal things like what to have for dinner, or whether we should repaint the kitchen, and those ordinary moments felt precious. On a sunny Saturday morning, I took Taylor and Delia to the park near our house. They ran straight for the swings, their identical faces lit up with pure joy as they pumped their legs to go higher. I pushed them and listened to their laughter and felt this fierce, protective love wash over me. Whatever crimes had been committed to create them, they were real children who deserved all the love and protection I could give them. They didn't ask to be born this way, didn't choose to be part of some twisted experiment. I would spend the rest of my life making sure they had both safety and happiness, that they grew up knowing they were wanted and cherished. Watching them play, I realized that the most important thing wasn't understanding exactly what happened in 2019 or making sure every person involved faced justice. The most important thing was these two little girls on the swings, giggling and asking me to push them higher, living their lives without the weight of knowing how they came to be. The criminal trial began on a cold Monday morning with news vans parked outside the courthouse and reporters shouting questions as we walked in. I attended every single day of testimony alongside other Mirror Mothers, and we sat together in the courtroom as a visible reminder that the defendants had hurt real families with their actions. Belle organized our seating so we filled 2 entire rows, and some days there were so many of us that people had to stand in the back. The prosecution called witness after witness describing the clinic's procedures, and the forged consent forms, and the shell companies used to hide money. Amira testified about what she'd seen as a nurse, and I watched the jury's faces change as they realized the scope of what had been done. Stewart explained the financial trail in terms everyone could understand, showing how the defendants had profited from our violation. Each day of testimony added another layer to the story, building a case that felt impossible to deny. The defense attorneys made their closing arguments trying to create doubt about the documentation, but the jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 2 of the 3 executives. The third executive had already accepted a plea deal the week before in exchange for testifying against his partners, which Quentin told us was unusual in cases this complicated. He pulled me aside after the verdict and said the combination of Amira's testimony, Stuart's financial records, and our documented experiences created an overwhelming case that the jury couldn't ignore. I sat in that courtroom with the other Mirror mothers and watched the executives get led away in handcuffs, and it felt like something heavy finally lifted off my chest. Belle transformed the Mirror Mothers Support Network into an official nonprofit organization within 2 months of the verdict. She secured grants from 3 foundations that fund reproductive justice work, and we hired a part-time coordinator to help families navigate the legal system and find counseling services. Families from Oregon, Nevada, and Colorado reached out after seeing news coverage of the trial, all describing the same pattern of memory gaps and identical twin daughters. What started as my personal crisis at a gas station had grown into a national movement pushing for stronger protections and oversight of fertility clinics. Belle organized quarterly gatherings where affected families could meet and support each other, and watching dozens of identical little girls playing together at these events still gave me chills, but also made me feel less alone. A full year passed since that day I saw the twins at the gas station, and I found myself sitting at my kitchen table on a Saturday morning, watching Taylor and Delia work on art projects with their matching serious expressions. I realized I wasn't constantly checking the windows anymore, or jumping every time my phone rang. The civil lawsuit was still moving through the courts, but Henrietta felt confident we would win a substantial settlement, and more importantly, Reproductive Health Solutions had permanently closed and could never hurt anyone else. Ronald and I had rebuilt our marriage through months of honest therapy sessions, and we were actually happy together again, in a way that felt stronger than before, because we'd fought through something terrible and survived it. I spent several hours each week helping new families navigate their own cases, using everything I'd learned to make their path easier. The Mirror Mothers organization was working with state legislators on new laws requiring better informed consent and oversight for fertility procedures. Life wasn't perfect, and my daughters would eventually need to know the truth about their origins. But right now, they were thriving 4-year-olds who loved painting and playing pretend. I watched their identical faces light up as they showed me their artwork, and I felt nothing except fierce love and gratitude that I'd fought hard enough to protect them and create something good from something terrible. Well, that's the grand conclusion of whatever that was. If you stayed to the end, congratulations. You clearly enjoy chaos. Go on, subscribe, and make this bad habit official. No judgment here.